Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You may be slightly surprised that I, as a conductor of Novaya Opera, are in fact not speaking directly about music. But you see, Oscar Wilde, as well as being a passion of mine, is so intricately involved and influential on so many musical ideas and thoughts that in fact, when I speak about him today, it is to emphasize the synergy that exists between music, between literature, and of course, and with the visual arts. In order to understand Wilde's works and his influence on the other arts, you often have to understand extremely well the character of the man and his personality, because rarely with other writers was the person so intimately connected with the work. As you probably know, Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin. Of course, he is not English, he is Irish, but never forget that at the time Ireland was a British colony, and once he went to Oxford, he never went back to Ireland. And we know just about, because there is one recording, which unfortunately I do not have here, which may be his voice. Because right at the end of his life, when he was exiled in Paris, he went to the World Exhibition in 1900. And amongst the exhibitors was Thomas Edison, who was showing off his phonograph. And we believe that Wilde made a recording. And in fact, because it is the last stanzas of the last poem that he wrote, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, it's just possible that this is his voice. And when you hear it, you will understand that it is very English and very, very beautiful English, but there is a certain Irish lilt about it, which makes us believe that it may just be his voice. Anyway, for those who are interested, it is on YouTube. And so if you just put Oscar Wilde's voice, you can hear it. Of course, the sound quality is extremely bad, as you would expect. Oscar Wilde's parents were both highly intelligent but very eccentric people. His father was an ear and eye surgeon of great repute and highly successful. He was the oculist general to Queen Victoria, Sir William Wilde, and he also more or less invented the cataract operation and went to Egypt. And he also had a time to write many books about Irish history. Both his parents were ardent Irish patriots. His mother was a poet who above all specialized in Irish nationalist poetry. And unusually for the times, they did not keep a governess or nanny. And so Oscar Wilde constantly was in the company of highly intelligent adults and heard much stimulating conversation, which he put to very good use later in his life. And although he had a sister who died, called Isolde, and an elder brother who was tried to be a writer, but in the end was a hopeless alcoholic who did just about nothing. And by the way, the brothers had a very bad relationship. It was Oscar Wilde who was his parents' absolute favorite. His mother absolutely doted on him, and in fact came to live, after the death of her husband, came to live very near him in London. Oscar Wilde has the reputation, of course, of being an incomparable conversationalist. This is true, and one has the impression, because he wanted to give the impression that he was so talented that he never had to work. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth in the early part of his life. He was the most diligent, hard-working student, both at school, then at his Irish university, Trinity College, Dublin, from which he got a scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford. This in itself, for someone who was not born in England, was an immense achievement, and he only did it by hard work. And one thing he used to say when he was at Trinity College, Dublin, was, whereas all his friends every evening after the classes would basically go to pubs and get drunk, he didn't do this. He preferred to sit at home reading. And he said, when asked why he never went out with his friends, he said, you know, why should I enjoy their company when, if I read Stendhal or Balzac, I can have the company of Père Goriot, or this person, or Lucien de Rubempré, etc., etc. So he realized the importance of immensely studious reading. When he came up to Oxford, he read Latin and Greek, but also showed a marked interest already in writing his own poetry. It was not particularly good, but he realized that in order to write well in English, it was essential to have an extremely good command of Latin and Greek. This, of course, is still true today. But in his case, the structure of the languages of Latin and Greek were such that, having mastered them, he was aware of all the nuances in English. He actually won a prize at Oxford, the Newdigate Prize, for his poems, namely one called Ravenna. And he left Oxford extremely optimistically, but in fact had no idea what he was going to do. And one of his university friends asked him, Oscar, what are you going to do in life? He replied, I'll be famous. And if not famous, I will be infamous, notorious. Of course, both predictions were completely true. When he came to London, he had this very bizarre contradiction, which is extremely Irish. You see, the Irish, although, so to speak, being oppressed by the English, somehow looked up to them and wanted to imitate them. And so there was a universal snobbery amongst the educated Irish to somehow get into English society at the highest levels. Oscar Wilde realized that, having no money, because his father had died more or less penniless, that he would have to draw attention to himself in a highly exaggerated and rather eccentric way in order to make his way in the world. Now, how did he do this? He became a character. He dressed in the most outrageous clothes. He went around walking down Piccadilly in London with a huge carnation in his lapel, which he'd coloured green, and became, so to speak, a well-known socialite. He was actually writing very little. He was doing some book reviewing. He worked as an editor for a magazine. He then decided that, although deep down he was a rebel against the hypocrisy of Victorian society, he somehow wanted both to be a part of it and to rebel against it. Now, this is something which, as a pattern, you will see happening again and again in his life. He wrote an early play, which was a complete failure, called Vera, or The Nihilists, actually about Russian revolutionaries, but it's completely forgettable. Apart from one line, when one of the princes is having a big meeting with a lot of other people. And he's saying, I must say, I do find these meetings so tiring. And then one of his colleagues says, naturally, because you're always talking. And he says, no, it's not the talking that makes me tired, it's all the listening I have to do that makes me tired. This is actually the best line in the play. However, apart from this, he decided to get known with the very important celebrities of the day. At the time, the most beautiful woman and most famous actress in England was called Lily Langtry. She was also one of the mistresses of King Edward VII, who was then, of course, not King Edward, but Prince of Wales, eldest son of Queen Victoria. And so he made a point of going to all her plays and throwing flowers at her feet and becoming a sort of groupie of hers, but at the same time getting to know her friends and generally getting known in society. Of course, one unbelievable gift that he had, and this is, I have to say, having known many Irishmen in my life, this is a peculiarly Irish gift. Nobody talks better than the Irish. They have this extraordinary gift for spontaneous conversation. Now, when you couple this with an absolute genius like Wilde, it is very clear that there was probably no one in the entire Western world at the time who could talk as well as Wilde. And this influenced his way of living for the rest of his life. Much later on, after his tragedy, after he had been in prison, he confessed to one of his friends, one of his closest friends and ex-lovers, Robert Ross. He said, "Do you know what the tragedy of my life is, Robbie?" And he said, "What?" He said, "I have put my genius into my life and only my talent into my works." This is a very, very important point because it shows that in the end, he liked nothing more than sitting around a table and dazzling everybody with his insuperable conversation. Now, of course, he used to be very ironic about himself. One of the things he said is, "A man who can dominate a dinner table can dominate the world." Now, unfortunately, in his case, this was not correct, because certainly he dominated dinner tables, and later on, at the height of his success, he dominated at least literary and dramatic London, but he never dominated the world. In order to get into society and be somehow accepted by the society that he both wanted to be part of and rebel against, he decided that he had to get married, like all proper bourgeois Victorians. He met a lady called Constance Lloyd, a rather boring but very, very, very proper lady from a quite rich family. And he wrote to her in such dazzlingly interesting letters. He met her, and she, of course, was completely taken with him, mainly by his exuberant personality and by, of course, his genius. However, her family saw through this immediately and were totally against the marriage because her family were extremely bourgeois, lawyers, doctors, and they realized what future a woman would have married to a brilliant man who essentially had no job. Then as now, fathers always want security for their daughters, and this was the one thing that Wilde could not and did not provide. However, he managed to convince them, and at the beginning the marriage was very happy and produced 2 children in quick succession, Cyril and Vivian. However, Wilde got very bored by marriage. There was something stiflingly dull about the routine of married life. And when with the children making noises all the time, and he was now beginning to write not terribly successfully. And this is one thing that is not so known about Wilde, which was that his poetry, on the whole, is rather weak. He was very, very, very influenced by Swinburne, by Rossetti, and it's like a sort of pale imitation. As you will realize, his main success was with his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and of course his plays, namely his last and greatest one, The Importance of Being Earnest. And so, being bored with marriage, he began to seek a double life. It is impossible to speak about Wilde, the artist and the man, without broaching a subject that may be very sensitive in today's Russia, his homosexuality. But he declared right at the end of his life that he had always been homosexual. There is some doubt about this, because we know that he started the regular practice, if you like, of homosexuality after 2 years of marriage. The timing could not have been worse. This is a very important point, because in that very same year, the Victorian Parliament passed a law making homosexuality, even between consenting adults in private, a crime. This was a curious law because it was intended initially to protect child prostitutes against exploitation. But then one very homophobic member of parliament insisted that it should apply to male prostitution as well. This then led to all homosexual activity between males being prohibited. A rather amusing footnote to this is that it was also meant to include lesbianism, but when Queen Victoria had to sign the royal assent to this bill, and she saw this phrase, she looked at her minister and said, "Surely this is not possible." And the minister was too embarrassed to, should we say, disillusion her, and so that part was never passed. However, although Wilde was aware of this, he was not capable of adhering to these laws, because he began to live this double dangerous life. And when you look at his works, you will always see this theme. This is a constant theme that runs through it, the double life. Take the importance of being earnest, for instance. You see, Jack Worthing, the main character, he is called Jack in the city, where he leads a respectable life, but he also is called Ernest. He has invented a brother called Ernest, so he can be somebody completely different in the country. He calls this Bunburying. And so he began to lead a double life. Of course, he was aware of this. And one of his most well-known sayings is, "The one charm of marriage is that it makes a life of double deception absolutely necessary for both parties." Now, Constance, of course, like her name, was not like this. She was very, 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 very concerned about her children. And although she immensely admired her husband, there was always this slight feeling of disapproval. And she had a terrible habit of interrupting him when he was talking. One famous occasion, he was involved in the most beautiful conversation, which I will tell you about in a moment. And she suddenly interrupted him and said, "Oscar, did you manage to pick up the shoes for Vivian that I'd asked you to do?" And she totally ruined his thread and his train of thought. And this irritated him immensely. The story he was telling is one of the most important, and this is recounted by one of his early biographers, Hesketh Pearson, who, although he never met Wilde, he met many people who knew him, and this is a story that illustrates his attitude to imagination and real life. See, for him, real life was imagination. And it may be difficult for you to understand this, but his story illustrates it perfectly. There was once a man in a village who was very wise, and every evening when the villagers came back from work, they would ask him, "What have you done today? What have you seen?" He said, "You know, I took a marvelous journey through these forests, and in these forests I saw satyrs and nymphs, and then I saw an extraordinary fountain near the forest, and there was a mermaid, and then I went on further and I saw a centaur, you know, half man, half horse, and I spoke to him, and he was very curious to see another human being." And the villagers were absolutely fascinated. The next day, when they came back from their work, they asked him the same question. And he gave a different story about all the wonderful things he'd done and seen, and they were equally fascinated. As it happened, one day, he actually had to go on a journey, and he went through a forest. This man went and saw all these things because he had to go out of the village and see everything. And when he came back in the evening, all the villagers came round to him, said, "What have you seen today?" And do you know what he answered? "I have seen nothing." And this proves Wilde's point, that the real world for him was the imaginary world. This is why he lied so often. This is why he was incapable of telling a story without embroidering it, so that at the end he had a true fact, and then he would begin to play with it. He would embellish it, embroider it, and in the end it was completely unrecognizable. He just let his imagination flow. Now, things went along in a pretty good way, and at one stage became so famous simply as a character that a British composer and his librettist, who were extremely popular at the time, called Gilbert and Sullivan, they were the equivalent today of Rodgers and Hammerstein. They wrote what today would be called musicals, and they wrote these operettas, The Mikado, Pirates of Penzance, still very popular in Britain. And they decided to parody Oscar Wilde in one of their shows. This had the effect of making him, as a character, quite well known in America, because Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were very well known there, because of the language, of course. And so the American public became very curious to see Oscar Wilde, and a very enterprising lecture manager arranged a huge tour of the States, which lasted 6 months. And he went all over America, expounding his views on life, on art, on architecture. He had a very, very precise idea of how a house should look, both inside and outside. In fact, he even wrote an article called The House Beautiful. His lectures in America were huge successes, but the audiences were very, very confused and perplexed by the character, because in America there was a great conformism then, and to see such an eccentric character as Oscar Wilde, although was fantastic from a publicity point of view, left them rather perplexed and unsure what to make of this strange human being. I have to say, from his part, Oscar Wilde was not very impressed by the lack of American culture, then as now. And he had a very weak view of America, the one poet that he absolutely wanted to see and meet was Walt Whitman. And he managed, after much trying and difficult circumstances, to meet Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, of course, was very, very well known then, mainly for his poetry, Leaves of Grass. But Oscar Wilde had a most rewarding conversation with him. And although we know now that Walt Whitman was probably homosexual, what Oscar Wilde said when he came back to England was, "I still have the kiss of Walt Whitman upon my lips." Very elegant. However, much more damaging to the Americans, from his point of view, was when he was just leaving New York to go back to Southampton. And of course, all through his lecture tour, he had been followed massively by journalists, newspapers, and book writers, everybody. And they wanted to know his impressions of America. And with one foot safely on the boat, he said, "To you Americans, I only have one thing to say. Art has no meaning, beauty has no marvel, and the past has no message." And later on, when he was in England, he said something even funnier. He said, "It seems that only in America have they passed from barbarism to decadence without civilization in between." When he came back from America, he'd earned a bit of money, and so he began to live a little bit more extravagantly. Like many Irishmen, he was incapable of living within his means. And so he got into debt. And then finally, he decided that he was going to write a novel. He'd been thinking about this novel for a great length of time. And it was a novel that was originally published in a magazine. And of course, it became his only and very well-known novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. But The Picture of Dorian Gray proved a double-edged sword. As you say in Russian, what do you say? Меч о двух концах. Палка о двух концах. And because it made him, for once, very, very well known as a writer, but it was considered so scandalous at the time that many bookshops refused to stock it, because it was regarded as being a deeply immoral book. Why is it immoral? Of course, because it explores the idea of sin, a Faustian type of arrangement, and this double life. Of course, it is a wonderful idea, because once the idea came to him when he was looking at a portrait that someone had painted of a friend of his. And he once said, just using his imagination, "Dear Robbie, wouldn't it be wonderful if the portrait could age, but I did not have to, or you did not have to?" And this remained in his mind as the germ of an idea, which of course became The Picture of Dorian Gray. And you see, the reason it became so scandalous was, although homosexuality is not directly talked about, it is always implied. The female characters are very weak, and the three main male characters, Lord Henry Wotton, but although he is married, all his philosophy about life is very much against marriage. One of the things he says to Dorian is, "You know, women have nothing to say, but they do say it most prettily." Typical Lord Henry Wotton. And of course, the painter, Basil Hallward, who has painted Dorian's portrait, is quite obviously in love with him. And of course, this now strengthens the idea that Wilde had throughout his entire artistic life about art. For him, art for art's sake. He believed in creating very specifically beautiful works of art that had no particular moral, even immoral message, that were absolutely beautiful in themselves. And this at the time was rather novel for the Victorians, because they always believed that art had to be educative or warning against something, always had to have a subtext. But for Wilde, pure beauty was in itself something so extraordinary that art had to express this. In fact, he said, art sometimes expresses nothing but itself. Now, the occasion of writing this book led indirectly to his great tragedy, which we do have to talk about in detail. Although he had successfully led this double life for a very long time, it had not really reached the ears and eyes of the people that matter. So that there were rumors that he had affairs with boys, there were rumors that the relations with his wife were not so good, but it really wasn't that important. And of course, Wilde loved that people talked about him. One of the other most famous things he said was, there is only one thing worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. Sometime after the book was published, through a friend of his who was a student at Oxford, he met a young man called Lord Alfred Douglas. Lord Alfred Douglas was a beautiful young man, aristocratic. His father was the Marquis of Queensberry, but he was a rather lazy young man. But he had written, he was highly educated, and he had read 6 times The Picture of Dorian Gray. He was dying to meet its author. And so when he had a chance through this mutual friend, Lionel Johnson, he took it. Wilde fell for him immediately. But although Lord Alfred Douglas, who was known all through his life as Bosie, because when he was a little boy, his mother had called him Boise, and this became Bosie instead. He liked Wilde, was not in the slightest bit attracted by him, and so they developed rather slowly their relationship. However, after he met Douglas, he realized that he was actually a very difficult person. Above all, he was very lazy. He was expelled from Oxford without taking a degree, simply through his laziness. But at the time, you have to understand what sort of university Oxford was. It was a university where if somehow you could be accepted through a scholarship, you had to work very hard. But for all the upper class English people who attended it, the important thing was to be there, and actually not that important to work. In fact, Wilde remembers very, very well, he was in the middle of tutorial. In Oxford you have this system where students have one-to-one sessions with their professors, known as tutorials. And he'd never forgotten, he was in the middle of one session with a tutorial, when suddenly a young man knocked at the door and said, just to inform you, I've managed to get 4 days hunting and shooting during the week, and therefore I won't be attending any of your lectures. End of conversation. This gives you an idea of how arrogant our undergraduates were, but if they were rich and had aristocratic names, no matter. However, in Bosie's case, he did so little work that this was even too much for an aristocrat, and he was sent down from Oxford. Wilde began to spend an increasing amount of time with him because he was so obsessed with him. But he was exploited by him because Although he was very rich, he was extremely mean, Lord Alfred Douglas, and he expected Wilde to pay for everything, which Wilde did. And Wilde loved extravagance, pure extravagance. "I have only the simplest taste, only the best," he said once. "My tastes are very simple. I am only satisfied with the best." This applied to everything, whether it was clothes, food, furniture, whatever. And although the relationship developed, and eventually at some stage they became lovers, although the effect upon Wilde from a personal point of view was extremely negative, it inspired him to write his very best work. All his great plays were written in the period that he was with Lord Alfred Douglas. Then, of course, they became very successful, his plays. A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband. And when you look at them in detail, you realize how bound up they are in every possible way with his personal life. Let's look at An Ideal Husband. As always, it's about a double life. It's about an extremely successful young politician, but not coming from a wealthy family, but only from his own efforts has become essentially a cabinet minister. He had had the chance to earn an enormous amount of money by revealing some important political information to an Austrian financier, like insider trading, if you like, what we call it today, and has made a huge amount of money. Unfortunately, this fact is known by a woman, a former acquaintance of his, and she blackmails him that she is going to tell the secret. Unless this, unless that, unless this, because what has happened is that as a result of this information, he became very rich, but shortly in the House of Commons, in Parliament, there's going to be a debate about an Argentinian loan. And it turns out that this woman will gain financially very much if it's passed, this law. But if in the debate this politician, the hero of the play, speaks against it, she will lose a lot of money. So basically she blackmails him, saying, if you don't speak against it and make sure the bill is not passed, I shall reveal your secret. And she has a letter. Right, I won't go into the details, but in the end, everything ends happily. And but what is the message of this play? It is always the same: the double life and the guilty secret. And at the end of the play, Robert, the hero, he speaks about his marriage to his very faithful wife, who's been supporting him through all this, but not really understanding what the whole thing is about. Why do women put us always on pedestals? Why do they always look up to us for our gods so that we can fall down quickly? Why do they not see us for all our faults, for our human weaknesses? Now, as much as this developed relationship with Bosie happened, Bosie had a father. He came from, he was divorced from his wife because of his insufferable Don Giovanni-like behavior, but he was one of the most detestable, nasty aristocrats of the many that unfortunately the Victorians produced. He was very rich. He had several sons, and one of his sons, the eldest brother of Bosie, was an extremely successful young politician and was private secretary to the then Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery. Queensberry was the most right-wing, very, very conservative member of the House of Lords. He understood or heard rumours about this relationship with Oscar Wilde, of his son. And he began to pursue them, to make life impossible for him, but absolutely impossible. And as a result, he started threatening him. If I ever see the two of you together, I will hit you. He used to go around, Bosie used to go around with a pistol in his pocket in case the father should see him. What was very odd was that when he actually met Wilde the first time, over lunch in the Café Royal, he was completely seduced, completely charmed by Wilde's personality. And he said afterwards, actually, he's not such a bad fellow. But when he realized how Wilde emotionally dominated Bosie, he then absolutely was not going to tolerate this. Now, at the same time, another tragedy was happening. In fact, Wilde was making life extremely difficult for himself because he had never understood what Freud has always said about human beings, that we all have a death wish, and our success in life is dependent on how successfully we combat this death wish. He was, in this case, Wilde, absolutely determined to be the author of his own destruction. Because knowing how dangerous it was to be openly homosexual at a time when there was, not only was it illegal, but in 1889 there had been a very major scandal when it was discovered that a whole group of aristocratic Englishmen were in fact essentially using a certain building in central London as a brothel for male prostitution, boys coming from the nearby post office. This had come to the notice of the authorities. The press went completely mad, but only, and this shows the hypocrisy of Victorian England, only because the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, happened to be a very good friend of one of the aristocrats involved. They managed somehow to sweep the scandal under the carpet. It was known as the Cleveland Street scandal, and allowed the main aristocrats involved simply to depart the country and to live abroad as exiles. This should have been a great warning to Wilde, but being so enthusiastic about his self-destruction, he could not take it seriously. He then created even more scandal by essentially abandoning his house in Chelsea, where at times he could still be a very faithful and loving husband, above all with the children, because he did have a very good relationship with them, despite everything. But when one of his plays was in rehearsal at the Savoy Theatre, he simply decided to live at the Savoy Hotel, which was then, as now, the most expensive hotel in London, and it had just been built in 1889. And he lived there essentially for months at a time at ruinous cost with Bosie, creating very much scandal because they used to bring other guests in, and in the end, some of the more conservative guests refused to dine in the same room as them, and the management somehow had to sort of discreetly ask them to leave many times. But when after rehearsals, Wilde was asked, "Why do you not go home to Chelsea? It's not that far." And don't forget, at that time, we already had a metro in London, which connected Sloane Square with Piccadilly Circus. Wilde said, "You know, I can't remember the number of my house." Not a very convincing excuse. Constance was never quite aware of what was going on. She was very, very naive. And when she met all these young men, because Wilde at the beginning was very enthusiastic about introducing all these young men to his wife. Whether this was a sort of double bluff protection, we're not sure. But she liked Alfred Douglas. She liked all of them very much. and she didn't really understand the subtext of his life. However, the relationship with Bosie became increasingly difficult because his behavior became outrageously unacceptable. He was exploiting him, and he had a terrible temper. He would insult Wilde in the most terrible way possible. And then Wilde would resolve never to see him again, and then he would beg for forgiveness. And Wilde, in this sense, emotionally very weak, would always give in and start the relationship again. However, after one unbearable scene, he decided that he would not ever see Lord Douglas again. And so he broke off the relationship. However, some months after this, Lord Alfred Douglas's elder brother died in a hunting accident. Or so we are told to believe. However, the truth has really come out in the last 10, 15 years. What had happened was this. Bosie's elder brother, as I said before, was a highly successful politician and was private secretary to the then Prime Minister. What, unfortunately, had happened was that Lord Queensberry, their father, had heard rumours, unbelievably, that in fact the elder brother was having a homosexual affair with the Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, and had threatened to make this public, as had one or two other members of Parliament. The stress became unbearable for the elder brother, and in fact this hunting accident, we now know, was no accident but suicide. This caused a very sad scandal, and Wilde felt very sorry for Bosie after the suicide or death of his elder brother, and so resolved in the end at least to comfort him and to sympathize with him. So they then started their relationship again, but the persecution of Lord Queensberry became worse and worse and worse. At the same time, Wilde's creative imagination was at its very, very, very peak. He was at all first nights. He had 4 plays running in London. He was earning a phenomenal amount of money for the time, something like £10,000 a year, which today would be not far short of $1 million. Of course, spending more, because living in the Savoy and insisting on the most, as Bosie insisted always on the most expensive champagnes, the most expensive food, it ruined Wilde, even despite earning a lot of money. However, short of money now, and terribly in debt, he had to write desperately another play to earn money. And suddenly, a Henry James play failed at one of the London theatres, the Haymarket, and the actor-manager of this theatre suddenly needed a play in 2 or 3 months to open. And so he asked Wilde, do you have anything ready or half ready? And then Wilde had been thinking about the importance of being earnest. And so he actually completed it extraordinarily in 6 weeks. During a family holiday in Worthing, beautiful town in Sussex, with his wife and children. And why do you think in the play it's called Ernest Jack Worthing? It was simply because of the town that he had written it in. And Algernon was a very good friend of his at university. And Lady Bracknell was a place where he knew various people near Oxford. Of course, in this play, which is still today regarded as the finest comedy in the English language, because it is like a Rossini opera. It is like Quicksilver. You never know whether it is trivial or serious. And he said, a serious play about trivial people, or a trivial play about serious people. Well, what happened. It was the biggest success that London had ever seen. Now, you probably know, at least some of you know the play well, so I will not dwell on it, but it's basically about these two gentlemen who lead double lives and are great friends, and then one of them wants to be engaged to this lady called Gwendolen, who has the most ferocious Aunt Augusta. And in one of the most famous dialogues in the play, and by the way, in Oscar Wilde's plays, until now, they had one great weakness, because the problem with Wilde's plays, even a little bit in The Importance of Being Earnest, is that the dramatic structure is always slightly inferior to the quality of the dialogue. You see, when you watch an Oscar Wilde play, the first thing you think about is that all the characters are Oscar Wilde. Now, in the case of A Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde actually admitted this. He said, Basil Hallward is what I think I am, Lord Henry Wotton is what the world thinks I am, and Dorian Gray is what I would like to be. And so, of course, all three are an amalgam of his character. In The Importance of Being Earnest, the structure is much tighter. The way the characters are drawn is so clear, and although there is an absence of real feeling, the dialogue is so magnificent. Take, for instance, when Gwendolen declares that she wants to marry Jack Worthing, Lady Bracknell says, you know, Mr. Worthing, it is absolutely impossible that you should even be considered as a possible husband for my daughter without me asking you a few questions. And so she begins to ask him a huge series of incredibly funny questions. She says, for instance, I'm of the opinion that a gentleman should know everything or nothing. What is it in your case? And he says, I know nothing. And she says, a very good answer. She says, I'm always of the opinion that ignorance is like a most beautiful fruit. If you touch it, the bloom is gone. Just to give you one example. And then she says, as well as having a country house, you can hardly expect such a refined girl as Gwendolen to live in the country. Do you also have a townhouse? Then he says, yes, I do. And she says, where is it? And he says, Belgrave Square. Now, Belgrave Square is the most expensive square in London. It's where a lot of the embassies are, where I believe, what's his name? The owner of Chelsea Football Club, the Abramovich, he has a house there. And, you know, and anyone who lived in Belgrave Square, you know, must have been a millionaire at the time. And so she says, Belgrave Square, what number? And he says, 147, which is a complete nonsense, as there are only about 47 houses in Belgrave Square. And she says, the unfashionable side. Now, I will just tell you one tiny anecdote, which has nothing to do with Wilde, but has everything to do with this story, which shows how unexaggerated Wilde's humor is. Many years ago, I was buying a house, and I went to see a house in a very nice square in London called Pelham Crescent. But I also looked at a house in Pelham Place, which is just off it. And so the owner of the house was a very refined lady, a bit like Lady Bracknell. And she said, and I said, because I'd already seen a house in Pelham Crescent that I hadn't liked. And I said, where are you moving to? And she said, we're moving to Pelham Crescent. And it was a bit strange, because it's like 20 meters away from Pelham Place. And I said, "Oh, that's funny, because I saw a house last week in Pelham Crescent, which I didn't like very much." And she said, "Which number?" And I said, "Oh, number 4. And she said, "Ah, the unfashionable side." So you see, when you think, as Wilde so rightly said, he said, it's not that art imitates life, life imitates art. However, the reception and first night of The Importance of Being Earnest was the start of the great tragedy which we must talk about. Because Marquis of Queensberry had hoped to create a scandal. So he'd bought a seat for the play and had come clutching huge amounts of rotten vegetables which he had intended to throw at Oscar Wilde when he came on stage at the end of the first night to take his bow. However, Oscar Wilde had heard about this, and so he had asked the police to stop the Marquis of Queensberry entering the theatre, which they managed to do. They cancelled his ticket and he was barred entry. So the first night was a triumph. However, a fortnight after the triumph, on the 28th of February, Wilde went to one of his gentlemen's clubs, because he was a member of many clubs. This one was called the Albemarle. And when he was leaving it, the porter of the club passed him an envelope and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Wilde, Lord Queensberry has asked me to give this to you." And he opened it, and there was a small visiting card of the Marquis of Queensberry, and he just wrote, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." That was all. Wilde was absolutely upset. He just didn't know what to do. He thought, if this is what the Marquis of Queensberry can do to me, what next? He is ruining my life. Now, of course, what he should have done, as he was told much later, was simply throw it away and forget about it. But he consulted Bosie. Now, Bosie had his own agenda. Bosie hated his father and wanted to see his father in prison, wanted to see his father on trial in a court. And so he absolutely pushed and pushed and pushed Wilde to take criminal action against the Lord Queensberry. This was an absolute disaster, total disaster, because against the advice of his real friends who said, "You are crazy," he said, "No, we have to do this. You have to do this." And so he accused Lord Queensberry of what is called criminal libel. This means damaging the reputation of a person to the extent that you can actually go to prison. So he started the case, and his lawyer asked him, "Of course we will make this case against Lord Queensberry, but can I have your absolute assurance that this allegation is completely wrong and false?" He said, "Absolutely." The worst mistake of his career and life. What happened? Queensberry, not short of money, employed private detectives to investigate Wilde's private life. Not only that, Queensberry engaged the very best lawyer to cross-examine him, Sir Edward Carson, who ironically had been a fellow student with Oscar Wilde at Oxford University. And when Wilde heard that this lawyer was going to cross-examine him, he said, "I'm sure he will do his duty with all the bitterness of an old friend." So the trial began. And don't forget, Wilde was the prosecutor and Queensberry was the defendant. But now became the most extraordinary and greatest cross-examination in British legal history between Wilde and Carson. In fact, only recently, 10 years ago, was the full transcript of this trial available. It was discovered by chance. And so, of course, I've read it, and it is a fantastic document because it is the only actual document where you see how Wilde spoke, because it was, of course, transcribed by a secretary, every word, and so you can see it was like a battle of wits. Many phrases are famous in this trial. And at the beginning, Wilde defended himself extremely well against the literature charge, because one of the things that Carson wanted to prove was that his literature influence had been very homosexual, and he had poisoned the minds of a whole generation of young men by his literature. And he defended himself very, very well. For instance, he said, would you say that The Picture of Dorian Gray is an immoral book? And he said, no, there is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are either well written or badly written. Very wise comment. When I conduct operas, and sometimes I conduct traditional stagings, and sometimes very contemporary stagings, I'm always reminded of this phrase. Because people say, do you like contemporary productions of opera, or do you prefer traditional? And I say, neither. Productions are either good or bad. And it's exactly the same. And there can be a very good contemporary one and a very bad traditional one, or the other way around. So he defended himself very, very well. But unbeknown to Wilde, Queensberry's private detectives had tracked down all the prostitutes that Wilde had been with. And I forgot to mention that he had been frequently blackmailed, chantage, by many prostitutes, because once he wrote a very loving letter to Lord Alfred Douglas that had found its way into the hands of one of these boys, blackmailers, and he tried to ask Wilde to give him money in order to give him back to it. And he said, I would like £60 and I will give you back the letter. And Wilde said, my God, I never knew my letter was worth £60. It's a marvelous piece of literature, but I don't need it. And so it never worked, the blackmail. However, coming back to the trial, he defended himself very, very well about the literature. But Queensberry's lawyer, Carson, knew all the details of all the wonderful meals that he'd entertained. And part of Wilde's problem was that he had this passion for very working class, low class young men. Now, in Victorian times, society was totally socially stratified. So no class ever spoke or had anything to do with the other strata of society. So you had the servant class, and then you had the sort of lower middle class, you had the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats. And it was impossible to move from one to another. And no gentleman would ever be on social terms with the lower class. And so he was, I notice here that you took out to dinner a lot of young men at this very expensive restaurant, and you served iced champagne, rather extravagant to give dinners to an out-of-work servant, a railway porter, a bellboy at the hotel. Don't you think so? I mean, what's a gentleman like you doing, giving champagne to these people? He said, not at all. Iced champagne is a favourite drink of mine, much against my doctor's orders. And then Queensberry said, never mind your doctor's orders, sir. And he said, I never do mind them. However, this went on very well, But things were getting more and more tricky, more and more tricky. And then came the killer. He was accused of meeting a young man at Oxford, a servant. And he was asked, did you know him? Were you nice to him? He said, yes, I was very, very nice. And then he said, did you kiss him? And Wilde said, no, 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 no. He was too ugly. And this was the fatal mistake at the trial. And so Carsten says, was that why you didn't kiss him? Because he was ugly? And he had then betrayed himself completely. What happened was the trial collapsed because Queensberry's lawyer had now paid or threatened all these young men to actually appear in the trial as witnesses, and already some of them had appeared, but somehow the defense lawyer had somehow managed to show that they were all liars, and so their evidence should not be taken seriously. But when Queensberry threatened, or the lawyer threatened, to bring all these other young men, the defense lawyer realized that Wilde was going to lose the case. And so he decided to withdraw from the case, and so, of course, he lost, and Queensberry was declared innocent. Now, had the story ended there, fine. But Queensberry, being an extremely vindictive man, I repeat, vindictive, wanted to destroy Wilde. Having lost, as he said himself, having lost one son to a homosexual scandal, I'm not going to lose a second one. And so he passed all the papers of this trial to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Knowing that homosexuality was illegal, the government had no choice, and so they had to prosecute. And so 3 days after the collapse of this trial, Wilde himself was arrested. But the magistrate who had to sign the arrest order had a certain sympathy for Wilde because he was one of the most famous men in London, and this magistrate had enjoyed his plays. And so he deliberately delayed signing the arrest warrant in order to give time to Wilde to take the boat train to Dover and then to Paris, and to essentially live as an exile. But Wilde didn't want to do that. He could not. He preferred somehow to face the music. And so now began the second trial, where he was the defendant, and he decided not to show off, but to be very sober and to really try and just convince everybody that he was innocent, which of course he wasn't. And he had the advantage of having a lawyer who was much less skillful than Edward Carson, in fact rather boring. And so it was not so difficult to answer his questions. But one problem was a poem that Lord Alfred Douglas had written in Oxford University magazine, and it was called Two Loves. And it was all about one love and then the other love, which of course was referring to heterosexual and homosexual love. And the famous line was, "What are you?" said the other. "I am the love that dare not speak its name." And so he was questioned about this poem, although he hadn't even written it, but he knew that his lover had written it, the lawyer. So he said, "What is this love that dare not speak its name?" And then suddenly, Wilde, in 1 minute, gave a 1 minute, absolutely improvised lecture about the beauty of spiritual love between an older and a younger man. And he said, this is this higher form of affection which Socrates talked about. Plato made the very basis of his philosophy. You see it all through the sonnets of Shakespeare and in the works of Michelangelo. It is as pure as it is perfect. And it is when an older man has the intellect and the young man has all the hope of life. We are put in the dock for this by these unjust ideas, etc., etc. And he spoke apparently so beautifully that the public at the trial, because these trials were public, applauded, which made the judge furious. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the jury had to decide whether he was guilty or not. And they could not. And so finally, because they could not, what happened was he was essentially set free. And then, under English law, there can be another trial, or they can just leave it at that. And now we got Lord Queensberry showing his terrible side. He insisted, although he was nothing to do with the law, he insisted that the government should make another trial against Wilde because they didn't want to. And Carson himself said, I wish they would leave him alone now. And in fact, Carson, after he had destroyed Wilde by his cross-examination, when he came home that evening to his wife over dinner, he said very sadly, you know, my dear, I have destroyed the most brilliant man in London. He was doing his professional duty, but as a human being, he had great sympathy for Wilde. Problem was this, Queensberry threatened to blackmail the government against, with the alleged homosexual affair between his then dead son and the Prime Minister. And he threatened to expose the Prime Minister unless the government prosecuted Wilde again. And essentially, they had no choice. They simply had no choice. And so they started a third trial, and they brought in the government lawyer to lead the prosecution, the Solicitor General. He did his best, and this time there was no doubt. It was probably a fixed trial, but it didn't really matter, because Wilde's reputation had been so destroyed. You know, even between the trials, he had to live with a friend and didn't dare go out into the street. But after this last trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. You have no idea what this did to him. Of course, the press was delighted, just as now, particularly in England, there's nothing that they like more than a sex scandal. And the press went mad in their denunciation of Oscar Wilde. And he went to prison under terrible circumstances, with hard labor. This means they had to do these terrible exercises on the treadmill, 6 hours a day. They had to sew bags. It was really, I would say, not that different from a Dostoevskian experience in the Gulag. Not that different. Food was unspeakably bad. There was no health care. So he declined very, 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 very much. He was only allowed a letter once every 3 months and no visits for at least 6 months. He declined, he got ill, he lost weight. And then he actually was declining so much that there was a certain sympathy for him by a certain member of parliament who went to see him and begged the authorities to transfer him to a different prison. And in the end, they did. They transferred him to Reading Jail, therefore the Ballad of Reading Jail. And the governor of that prison was a very humane man who again admired Wilde. And he gave him for the first time books to read. He asked him what books he wanted to read. But Wilde's, so he felt a bit better. But Wilde's greatest achievement in prison was what is known now as De Profundis, because he finally decided to write a very, very, very long letter to his ex-lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. He wrote it, and consider the circumstances. He was not allowed to revise his work. He was given one page at a time, and he had to write, and then it was taken away, and then he had to write the next page. You know, like, he couldn't consider everything. He wasn't given a whole bundle of paper where he could make notes and make corrections. So he had to write it all in one go. Of course, it is a masterpiece, but it is a masterpiece not because of the truth of what he says, because some of the things he says are plainly not true and are absolutely the very bitter recriminations of an ex-lover. But it reveals him as a person. And also he talks about religion, about Christ, and he talks about, he admits, in a sense, his crimes. But in the end, although he attacks Lord Alfred Douglas terribly, the letter is so beautiful. And he finally ends up, "I've taught you many things, but now I wish to teach you something even more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow." What happened was, he was released after 2 years. He could not live in England because at the time, the fear of, he just was a persona non grata. He went to live in France. His wife, after all this, said, "I will not divorce you, but you are never to see Lord Alfred Douglas again." He agreed, and she said she would pay him a certain monthly sum. But of course, after some months, he saw Lord Alfred Douglas again, and she was so furious, she never had anything to do with him anymore, and she cut off his money. And even the relationship with Douglas never really recovered. Douglas was really a nasty person, and he was very opportunistic. Now that Wilde was an outcast, was a pariah, was an exile, it wasn't so attractive to be with him. And so he followed his own life. And then Wilde lived in Paris. He made several trips to Rome, Switzerland. He traveled, but he was a broken man. But after he was released from prison, there was only one thing he wanted to write, which was the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Now, this is not a ballad really about himself. In a way it is, of course, but it is a ballad about a soldier. When he was in prison, in Reading Gaol, the prisoners are not allowed to talk, but for 1 hour a day they exercise and they're allowed to walk round the prison yard. Not talking, but somehow they manage to whisper. And he always noticed one man who looked so melancholy as he was taking exercise. And he found out who it was. It was a young soldier that was going to be hanged, executed in 3 weeks, because he'd murdered his wife out of jealousy. And so the Ballad of Reading Gaol is actually about this soldier. And the most beautiful line in the whole poem, which of course was a metaphor a little bit for Bosie and himself, was, "He had killed the thing he loved, and so he had to die. And all men kill the thing they love." Think of Oscar Wilde's play Salome. Salome demanding the head of John the Baptist, who she has this great sexual lust for. All men kill the thing they love. By all let this be heard. And he says, the rich man with a sword, the brave man with a sword, the coward with the kiss. The brave man with the sword, and the coward, Judas, of course, with a kiss to Jesus. He wrote this, and somehow he managed to get it published, although it was very difficult. Needless to say, as soon as he was put on trial, all his plays were shut down from the West End. And so he had no more income. Queensberry made him give up his house. His house was sold. All the possessions were sold. All his library, his manuscripts, the children's toys, they were all sold at auction to anybody for nothing, to pay Wilde's debts, because he was in terrible debt. And so the end of his life is really a tragedy. He drank more and more, became a complete alcoholic. He had no friends. None of his friends wanted to really to visit him, except one or two. He was very lonely. He would just spend the whole day sitting in cafes, talking to anyone who would talk to him, and declined more and more, until finally, partly as a result of an injury sustained in prison, he died on the 30th of November, 1900, aged only 46. When one friend came to see him, and he knew that he was having problems paying his hotel bill, he said, "You see, not only am I living beyond my means, I'm dying beyond my means." He was extremely witty right until the end. As you know, he is buried in this beautiful cemetery in Paris, Père Lachaise. Now, what is the legacy of Wilde? This is perhaps my last and most important point. His plays will live on, but the only play that really is permanently in the repertoire is The Importance of Being Earnest, and to a lesser extent, An Ideal Husband. They are without any doubt the best plays. A Picture of Dorian Gray is still very, very much read, because simply it's so interesting. Although you could call Wilde, in a way, his writings now rather old-fashioned. In a sense they are, but they were very modern at the time. But don't forget what Wilde said himself. There is nothing as dangerous as being too modern, because one is then liable to become old-fashioned very suddenly. Unfortunately, to some extent, this applied to himself. And so what is the legacy of Wilde today? Probably the personality today is even greater than his works. Of course, we can admire them, but he lives on in all of us as probably the most remarkable conversationalist that has ever been. If there was anybody today, if I could choose to have dinner with somebody, I wouldn't choose people from my own profession. I wouldn't choose Beethoven, Mozart. Many musicians are actually rather boring people to speak to, because they're not conversationalists, they're composers. They're composers. But I wouldn't choose politicians, I wouldn't choose Churchill, Napoleon, none of these great figures. I would choose Oscar Wilde. I would just sit there and I would be dazzled by his conversation. But in the end, he does have one very important message for us, because he always believed, very truthfully, that the aim, the goal in our life is self-realization. And we should all aim for this goal. And if he leaves nothing else to us, that is enough. Thank you very much.